The forest was burning. Echo could feel the heat of the flames at her back as she ran, her scarred legs carrying her as fast as they could through the dense underbrush. The smoke burned her lungs, and her eyes streamed with tears, but she didn't slow down. She couldn't. Behind her, the Silver Moon Pack territory was being consumed by fire. A fire she was being blamed for starting. It didn't matter that she'd been the one to sound the alarm, that she'd been the one trying to save the pack's pups from the rapidly spreading flames. All that mattered was that Echo was different, and different meant dangerous. Her left side burned with pain, the scars that covered half her body pulling tight as she pushed herself harder than she had in years. The burn marks that snaked from her left foot all the way up to her temple were the result of another fire, one that had claimed her parents when she was just 7. She'd survived, but at a cost. Half of her body was a maze of twisted, silver-white scars that gleamed in the moonlight, and her left eye had been permanently damaged, turning the once brown iris a startling silver that seemed to glow in certain lights. For 15 years, the Silver Moon Pack had tolerated her presence. Not accepted, tolerated. She'd been useful enough as a hunter, with keen senses and a stealth that came from years of trying to be invisible. But she'd never belonged, never been truly part of the pack. Always the scarred girl, the half-burned child, the one people avoided looking at directly. Now, at 22, she was running for her life because when disaster struck, the pack needed someone to blame, and Echo was the perfect target. "The fire-marked witch started it!" The words of the pack's beta still rang in her ears, his face contorted with grief and rage as they dragged dead pups from the burning nursery. "She's cursed! She brings destruction wherever she goes!" It hadn't mattered that Echo had been the first one to smell the smoke, that she'd rushed into the burning building and saved 3 pups before the roof collapsed. Logic had no place in the face of such loss. They needed a scapegoat, and the scarred, silver-eyed woman was the obvious choice. The Alpha had given her a 5-minute head start before they would hunt her down like prey. It was more mercy than she'd expected, but barely enough to give her a fighting chance. So she ran, deeper into the neutral territories that separated the major packs, heading for the mountains where she might be able to lose her pursuers. The land grew wilder here, less traveled, with steep ridges and hidden valleys that few wolves bothered to explore. Behind her, she could hear the howls of the hunting party. They were gaining. Her scarred leg was beginning to falter, the muscles seizing with exhaustion. She wouldn't be able to maintain this pace much longer. The mountain loomed ahead, dark and forbidding. Most wolves avoided this particular peak. There were stories about it, about wolves who ventured too close and never returned, about shadows that moved on their own, about a pack of nightmare wolves with fur as black as midnight who served a king darker still. The Shadow Territories. Echo hadn't planned to come this way. No sane wolf would deliberately enter the domain of the Shadow King. But the hunting party was closing in, and the mountain offered her only chance of escape. "Better to die by shadow than be torn apart by my own pack," Echo muttered, changing course and heading directly for the base of the forbidden mountain. The howls behind her faltered slightly as her pursuers realized where she was leading them. Good. Let them hesitate. Let them fear. She'd lived with fear as a companion for 15 years. It held no power over her anymore. The first tendrils of shadow reached out as she approached the boundary. Actual, physical shadows that moved against the wind, curling around her ankles like curious cats. The stories hadn't exaggerated this part, at least. Echo kept running, even as the shadows thickened around her, even as the world grew darker despite the full moon overhead. The hunting party's howls stopped completely. They wouldn't follow her here. No one would. Echo slowed her pace slightly, her lungs burning, her scarred leg threatening to buckle beneath her. The shadows continued to swirl around her, but strangely, they didn't feel threatening. They felt curious, almost protective, the way they seemed to cushion her steps and ease the strain on her injured side. "What are you doing in my territory, little scarred one?" A voice came from everywhere and nowhere, deep and resonant and ancient. Echo froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't see anyone, but the shadows around her feet thickened, rose up like a wave, and solidified into the largest wolf she had ever seen. He was massive, standing easily 5 feet at the shoulder, with fur so black it seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. His eyes were the only color on him, a deep, burning amber that fixed on Echo with unnerving intelligence. The Shadow King? It had to be. Echo should have been terrified, should have cowered or begged, or at least shown proper deference to a clearly dominant alpha. Instead, she straightened her spine and met his gaze directly. "Running," she answered simply. "I'm running." The great wolf's head tilted slightly, those amber eyes moving over her scarred form with interest rather than the usual disgust or pity she was accustomed to. "From what?" he asked, his voice somehow still perfectly clear despite coming from a wolf's throat. Another myth confirmed. The Shadow King could speak in his wolf form. "My pack. They think I started a fire that killed several pups," Echo said, her voice raw from smoke and exhaustion. "I didn't. I tried to save them. But I look like this." She gestured to her scarred side. "So clearly, I must be evil." The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. She'd spent years accepting her lot, understanding that her appearance made people uncomfortable, that she would always be an outsider. But now, faced with execution for a crime she didn't commit, all that careful acceptance had shattered like glass. The Shadow King circled her slowly, his massive form moving with impossible grace for something so large. The shadows followed him, swirling in his wake like a cloak. "You are not afraid of me," he observed, and it wasn't a question. Echo gave a small, humorless laugh. "I've spent my life being the monster in other people's eyes. Why should I fear another monster?" Instead of anger, her words seemed to please him. The shadows around them lightened slightly, and the great wolf sat back on his haunches, regarding her thoughtfully. "Come," he said finally. "The hunting party has retreated, but they're camped at the border. They'll wait for you to emerge, assuming I don't kill you first." There was a dark amusement in his voice. "You'll need shelter for the night, at least." Echo hesitated. Following the Shadow King deeper into his territory seemed like trading one death for another. But exhaustion was quickly overtaking her, and her options were limited. "Will you kill me?" she asked bluntly. The Shadow King made a sound that might have been laughter, a rumbling deep in his massive chest. "Not tonight, little scarred one. Tonight, you interest me too much to kill." It wasn't the most reassuring answer, but it was honest, at least. Echo nodded and followed as he turned and padded into the darkness, the shadows parting before him like a curtain. They traveled for what felt like hours, though it was difficult to track time in the perpetual twilight of the shadow territories. The landscape was strange, familiar shapes of trees and rocks, but all slightly wrong, as if viewed through warped glass. The shadows moved constantly, forming patterns that almost made sense before dissolving again. Finally, they emerged into a clearing where a massive stone structure loomed against the night sky. Not a castle, exactly, but something older, more primal. A fortress carved directly from the mountain itself, with towers that spiraled up into the darkness and walls that seemed to shift and flow like the shadows themselves. "My home," the Shadow King said simply. "You may rest here until you decide what to do next." As they approached, figures materialized from the darkness. Wolves as black as their king, though not quite as large, with eyes in various shades of gold and amber. They watched Echo with the same curious interest their king had shown, without hostility, but with a predatory awareness that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "My guards," the Shadow King explained. "They won't harm you while you're under my protection." Inside, the fortress was surprisingly warm, with braziers of strange blue fire lighting the stone corridors. The Shadow King led her to a chamber with a bed, a wash basin, and a small table laden with food and wine. "Rest," he commanded. "Eat. We'll speak more in the morning." Before Echo could thank him or ask any of the dozen questions swirling in her mind, he was gone, dissolving into shadows that slipped beneath the door and vanished. Left alone, Echo finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her exhaustion. Her legs trembled, and her scarred side throbbed with pain. She limped to the basin, washed the soot and grime from her face and hands, and then fell onto the bed, too tired even to eat. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was that she'd escaped one danger only to place herself at the mercy of something potentially far worse. But strangely, she wasn't afraid. The Shadow King had looked at her scars with interest rather than revulsion, had spoken to her directly instead of avoiding her gaze. For the first time in 15 years, someone had seen all of her and not flinched away. Echo slept deeper than she had in years, without the usual nightmares of fire and screaming that had plagued her since childhood. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through a window she hadn't noticed the night before, illuminating the chamber in warm, golden light. For a moment, she was disoriented, the events of the previous day seeming like a distant dream. Then her body reminded her, every muscle screaming in protest as she sat up, her scarred leg stiff and painful. The food on the table had been replaced with a fresh breakfast. Fruits she didn't recognize, bread still warm from the oven, and a pot of something that smelled like honey and spices. Her clothes, torn and smoke-damaged, had been replaced as well. A simple outfit of soft leather and linen lay folded at the foot of the bed, dark gray in color, but with silver threading that caught the light. Echo dressed quickly, surprised to find the clothes fit her perfectly, even accommodating the limited mobility of her left side. The fabric felt soothing against her scarred skin, which usually chafed uncomfortably under most materials. As she finished the last of the strange sweet tea, a knock came at the door. Echo tensed, unsure what to expect. "Enter!" she called, her voice stronger than she felt. The door swung open to reveal not the massive wolf from the night before, but a man. He was tall, powerfully built, with skin the color of burnished copper and hair as black as the wolf's fur had been, falling in waves to his shoulders. His eyes were the same burning amber, fixed on her with that same unnerving intensity. The Shadow King in his human form. Echo had expected someone older, scarred perhaps, with the weight of his reputation etched into his features. Instead, he appeared to be in his early 30s, his face strikingly handsome, with a strong jaw and high cheekbones that gave him an almost regal appearance. The only hint of something otherworldly were the shadows that still clung to him, swirling around. His feet, and occasionally climbing up his arms like living tattoos. "You slept well," he said, and his voice was the same as the wolf's, deep and resonant. "Yes," Echo admitted. "Thank you for the shelter. And the clothes." He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her thanks. "You're feeling better?" "Well enough to travel, if that's your concern," Echo said, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. Despite his hospitality, she had no illusions that the Shadow King wanted a scarred refugee taking up permanent residence in his fortress. To her surprise, he smiled, a small quirk of his lips that transformed his face from intimidating to almost charming. "Actually, I was hoping you might stay a little longer. You've raised quite a stir at my borders. The Silver Moon Pack is demanding I return you to them for justice." Echo's blood ran cold. "And will you?" The Shadow King's smile vanished, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. "I am not in the habit of handing over those who seek sanctuary in my territory, especially not to packs that would execute someone based on superstition rather than evidence." Relief flooded through Echo so intensely that she had to sit down on the edge of the bed. "Thank you," she whispered. He waved a hand dismissively. "Don't thank me yet. My protection comes with conditions." Of course it did. Nothing was ever freely given, especially not to someone like her. Echo steeled herself, wondering what price the Shadow King would demand. Her service? Her loyalty? Her body? "What conditions?" she asked, proud of how steady her voice remained. "First, your name. The scarred one is hardly a proper way to address a guest." The request was so unexpected that Echo blinked in surprise. "Echo," she said after a moment. "My name is Echo." "Echo," he repeated as if tasting the word. "Fitting. I am Caney." He offered no title, no family name, just the single word. Caney. Somehow it suited him better than Shadow King. "Second," he continued, "I want you to tell me your story, all of it. How you got your scars, how you ended up with the Silver Moon Pack, and why they were so quick to blame you for their tragedy." Again, not what Echo had expected. "Why?" she asked before she could stop herself. Caney's amber eyes fixed on her with that penetrating gaze. "Because you interest me, Echo. Because you walked into the shadow territories without fear when hardened warriors wouldn't dare. Because you look at me. At this." He gestured to the shadows curling around him. "And you don't flinch. That makes you either very brave or very foolish, and I want to know which." It was the most honest answer anyone had given her in years, and it deserved honesty in return. "And the third condition?" she asked. "We'll get to that after I've heard your story," Caney said. "Come, walk with me. My fortress can be confining after a while." He offered his arm, a strangely formal gesture that seemed at odds with his fearsome reputation. After a moment's hesitation, Echo took it, acutely aware of the contrast between his unblemished skin and her scarred hand. If Caney noticed, he gave no indication. He led her through corridors that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves as they passed, up staircases that spiraled in impossible directions, and finally out onto a high balcony that overlooked the entirety of the shadow territories. From this vantage point, Echo could see that what had seemed like perpetual darkness from ground level was actually a massive canopy of shadow that hovered over the land like a protective dome. Beyond it, sunlight sparkled on distant mountains and forests, but within the shadow's embrace, everything existed in a state of gentle twilight. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way, like a world caught between day and night. "Now," Caney said, settling into a stone bench that overlooked the view. "Tell me your story, Echo of the Silver Moon Pack." And so she did. She told him about the fire that had claimed her parents and left her scarred. About being taken in by the Silver Moon Pack, not out of kindness, but obligation to the moon goddess's laws. She spoke of years spent on the periphery, useful enough to be tolerated, but never truly welcomed. She described the nursery fire, the desperate scramble to save as many pups as possible, and the moment when grief turned to accusation. Throughout her tale, Caney listened intently, his amber eyes never leaving her face, even when she spoke of the worst moments, the times when the pack's cruelty had cut deeper than any flame could reach. "They called me Burned Witch behind my back," Echo said quietly. "They said the silver in my eye was a mark of the devil, that the moon goddess had cursed me for some sin in a past life. The pups were warned not to play with me, as if my scars might somehow spread to them through contact. And yet you stayed," Caney observed. "For 15 years, you stayed with people who despised you." Echo shrugged, the movement pulling at her scars uncomfortably. "Where else could I go? No other pack would take in a scarred Omega with no family ties. At least with Silver Moon, I had shelter, food, a purpose of sorts. I told myself it was enough." "Until they tried to kill you," Caney said, his voice hardening. "Until they tried to kill me." Echo agreed. Silence fell between them, not uncomfortable but heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Caney stood, moving to the edge of the balcony with fluid grace. "The Silver Moon Pack has a reputation for being traditional to the point of archaic," he said. "They cling to old superstitions, old prejudices. Many of the other packs consider them backward, especially in their treatment of Omegas." Echo hadn't known this. Isolated as she'd been, she knew little of pack politics beyond Silver Moon's borders. "Is that why you're helping me?" she asked. "Some political game against Silver Moon?" Caney turned back to her, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "No, though I won't deny there's a certain satisfaction in denying them something they want. But my interest in you is personal, not political." There was something in his tone, something warm and dangerous all at once, that made Echo's pulse quicken. No one had ever looked at her the way Caney was looking at her now, like she was something valuable, something worth pursuing. "What is the third condition?" she asked, needing to break the intensity of the moment. Caney's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed slightly too sharp for his human form. "I want you to stay, not as a guest, not as a refugee, but as part of my pack. I want you to take your place among the Shadow Wolves." Echo stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You want me to join your pack? Me? A scarred Omega from Silver Moon?" "Yes," Caney said simply. "We are all outcasts here, Echo. Every member of my pack came to me as you did, fleeing from those who feared what they didn't understand, seeking sanctuary from a world that had no place for them." As if to illustrate his point, the shadows around him formed into distinct shapes, silhouettes of wolves with missing limbs, unusual proportions, or strange appendages that no natural wolf would possess. "The shadows allow us to hide our differences when we wish, to move through the world without judgment," Caney explained. "But here, among our own, we have no need for such concealment. Here, we are accepted for exactly who and what we are." It sounded too good to be true, a place where her scars wouldn't matter, where she might actually belong. Echo had spent so long adjusting her expectations downward, telling herself that mere tolerance was the best she could hope for, that the concept of true acceptance seemed like a fantasy. "Why me?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since Caney first showed her kindness. What makes me worthy of such an offer? Caney moved closer, his amber eyes intent on hers. From the moment you entered my territories, the shadows responded to you. Not as they do to intruders, with suspicion and hostility, but as they respond to Pack. They recognized something in you, something that resonates with our nature. As if to demonstrate, he gestured, and the shadows swirled up from the ground, caressing Echo's scarred side with gentle tendrils. Instead of feeling cold or frightening, they felt soothing, almost healing, as they traced the pattern of her burn marks. The fire that scarred you changed you, Echo. Not just physically, but on a deeper level. It marked you as one who has walked through destruction and emerged stronger. The shadows recognize that strength, that resilience. They want to embrace it, enhance it, honor it. Echo felt dizzy with the implications. Are you saying I have some kind of affinity for shadow? I'm saying you have an affinity for transformation, Caney corrected gently. Fire changed you. Shadow can change you again, if you allow it. Not by erasing what the flames did, those scars are part of you now, but by adding to your story, by giving your pain purpose and meaning. He held out his hand, palm up, shadows dancing across his skin like living ink. I won't force you, Echo. The choice must be yours. But know that if you choose to stay, you will never again be judged for your scars. You will never again be the burned witch or the scarred Omega. You will be Echo of the Shadow Wolves, and your fire-touched skin will be seen as a badge of honor, not a mark of shame. Echo looked at his outstretched hand, at the promise it represented. It would be so easy to take it, to accept this unexpected gift of belonging. But years of disappointment and betrayal had taught her caution. And what would my role be in your pack? She asked. What would you expect of me? Caney's expression softened, understanding in his amber eyes. For now, simply to heal, to learn our ways, to find your place among us without pressure or expectation. In time, if you choose to stay, we would find how your unique gifts best serve the pack. Every Shadow Wolf has a purpose here, a way to contribute that honors their particular strengths. It was more consideration than she'd been shown in 15 years with Silver Moon. There, she'd been assigned the tasks no one else wanted, positioned always on the periphery. Useful, but never valued. And you? Echo asked, unable to stop herself. What is your interest in me specifically? Alpha Wolves don't personally escort every potential pack member on balcony tours. Caney's laugh was unexpected and genuine, a warm sound that seemed to brighten the perpetual twilight around them. Direct, aren't you? I appreciate that. His expression grew more serious, though his eyes remained warm. My interest in you, Echo, is multifaceted. As Alpha, I'm interested in what you might bring to my pack. As a protector of outcasts, I'm interested in helping someone who has been wronged. And as a man, he paused, his gaze traveling over her face, lingering on her silver eye and the scarred side that most people avoided looking at directly. As a man, I find you fascinating, beautiful in a way that defies conventional standards, strong in ways that most wolves will never understand. Echo felt heat rising to her cheeks, unfamiliar emotions swirling through her. No one had ever called her beautiful before, certainly not while looking directly at her scars. She had been called useful, tolerable, acceptable at a distance, never beautiful. You don't need to flatter me, she said stiffly. I've agreed to consider your offer. Caney's expression didn't change. I don't flatter, Echo. I have no need for such games. When I say you're beautiful, it's because that's what I see. The fire wrote its story on your skin, and I find that story captivating. The silver in your eye reflects the light in a way that reminds me of the moon on water. Your scars map the journey of someone who walked through flames and survived, who endured years of cruelty and remained kind enough to run into a burning building to save the children of those who despised you. He stepped closer, and the shadows around them seemed to pulse with a life of their own. That kind of beauty is rare, Echo, and yes, I'm drawn to it. But my offer stands regardless of whether you ever return that interest. The Shadow Wolves would welcome you either way. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Whatever else Caney might be, Shadow King, Alpha of Outcasts, ruler of this twilight domain, he wasn't lying about this. Slowly, still half expecting him to withdraw the offer, Echo placed her scarred hand in his. I accept, she said quietly. I want to stay. I want to learn about the shadows, about your pack. I want. She hesitated, then finished with simple honesty. I want to belong somewhere. Really belong. Caney's fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, and the shadows swirled up their joined hands, binding them together in tendrils of living darkness. It didn't feel threatening or cold. It felt like a promise. Then welcome, Echo of the Shadow Wolves, Caney said formally. From this day forward, you are pack. You are one of us, and your enemies are our enemies. As if in response to his words, a chorus of howls rose from below. The Shadow Wolves acknowledging their alpha's declaration, welcoming their newest member. Echo felt something shift inside her, a weight lifting that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. For the first time in 15 years, she wasn't alone anymore. Come, Caney said, releasing her hand but staying close. It's time you met your new family. The days that followed were a revelation for Echo. The Shadow Wolves' pack was unlike anything she had experienced with Silver Moon. Where her former pack had been rigidly hierarchical, with status determined by birth and physical prowess, the Shadow Wolves operated more as a collective, each member's contribution valued regardless of their designation as Alpha, Beta, or Omega. And Caney had been right. They were all outcasts in one way or another. There was Lyra, a Beta with a twisted spine, who moved with surprising grace thanks to the shadows that supported her weakened muscles. Donovan, an Alpha who had lost an eye and an arm in battle, the shadows forming replacements that worked as well as the originals. Mina, an Omega whose skin was covered in scales like a snake's, beautiful and terrifying all at once. None of them flinched from Echo's scars. None of them avoided looking at her silver eye. If anything, they seemed to admire her markings, seeing them as evidence of her survival rather than something to hide. And through it all, Caney was there, guiding her, teaching her about the shadows and their power. He showed her how to call them, how to shape them to her will, how to let them enhance her natural abilities. The shadows respond to intent and emotion, he explained one evening as they practiced in a courtyard beneath the stars. They're not good or evil in themselves, they simply are. Like fire, like water, like any force of nature, they can heal or harm depending on how they're used. Echo was learning to extend her awareness through the shadows, to see and hear things happening at a distance. It was a skill that came naturally to her, as if the shadows were eager to show her their secrets. How did you come to command them? She asked Caney. Though she had been with the pack for weeks now, he had shared little of his own story, always turning the conversation back to her or to the present moment. Caney was quiet for so long that Echo thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual, tinged with old pain. "I was born with them," he said simply. "From my first breath, the shadows were part of me. My pack, my birth pack, saw it as a curse, a demon's touch. They tried to cure me at first, with rituals and punishments meant to drive out the darkness." His amber eyes were distant, seeing something far away and long ago. "When I was 7, they decided I couldn't be saved. They took me deep into the forest, bound me to a tree, and left me for dead." Echo's heart clenched. "They abandoned a child? Their own pack member?" Caney's smile was without humor. "Fear makes monsters of us all, Echo. They feared what they didn't understand, so they cast it out. But the shadows that they thought were my curse became my salvation. They kept me alive, brought me food, protected me from predators until I was strong enough to protect myself." He gestured around them, at the fortress, at the territories beyond. "I built all of this from nothing, gathered others like me, wolves that other packs had rejected or abandoned, taught them to use their differences as strengths rather than seeing them as weaknesses. And slowly, we became what you see now. Not a traditional pack, but a family bonded by choice and understanding rather than blood and obligation." Echo understood then why Caney had been so quick to offer her sanctuary, why he recognized in her something kindred. They had both been judged and found wanting based on appearances, both cast out by those who should have protected them. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for telling me, for understanding, for creating this place." Caney's expression softened, the shadows around him reflecting his changing mood by growing lighter, almost luminescent. "There's no need for thanks between pack, Echo." But there was something more in his eyes when he looked at her now, something that went beyond alpha and pack member, beyond teacher and student. Something that made her pulse quicken and her scarred skin feel suddenly too sensitive, too aware of the slight breeze in the courtyard, of the proximity of his body to hers. Over the weeks that followed, that something more grew between them, unacknowledged but impossible to ignore. Caney sought her out during pack gatherings, his amber eyes finding hers across crowded rooms. Their training sessions became charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the shadows they were manipulating. His hand would linger on hers when he corrected her form, and she found herself leaning into his touch rather than pulling away. The other pack members noticed, of course. Echo caught knowing looks from Lyra and Mina, heard the good-natured teasing Caney received from his closest lieutenants. But no one questioned it. No one suggested that the Alpha's interest in the scarred Omega was inappropriate or unworthy. If anything, they seemed pleased, as if this development was something they had hoped for. Echo tried to temper her growing feelings with caution. Surely Caney's interest was temporary, a fascination that would fade once the novelty wore off. Even in a pack of outcasts, there were wolves more suitable for an alpha than she was. Stronger, more talented with the shadows, unscarred by fire and prejudice. It was Mina who finally confronted her, cornering Echo in the herb garden where she had been working. Echo had discovered a talent for healing that, combined with her growing shadow abilities, made her uniquely suited to treating the pack's various ailments. "You're pulling away from him," Mina said bluntly, her scaled skin catching the twilight in iridescent patterns. "Why?" Echo busied herself with the herb she was gathering, avoiding Mina's direct gaze. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mina snorted, a very unladylike sound that somehow suited her perfectly. "Don't play dumb with me, Echo. I've seen how you look at Caney when you think no one's watching, and everyone has seen how he looks at you all the time, not caring who notices. So why are you fighting it?" Echo sighed, setting down her basket. There was no point in denying what was obviously apparent to everyone in the pack. Because it doesn't make sense, Mina. He's the Shadow King. He could have anyone. And he wants you, Mina said simply. What doesn't make sense about that? Look at me. Echo gestured to her scarred side, to her silver eye. I'm broken. Mina laughed, the sound surprisingly melodious. We're all broken here, Echo. That's rather the point. Caney doesn't want anyone. He wants someone who understands what it means to be different, to be feared, to be judged for something beyond your control. He wants someone who has faced the darkness and chosen to keep living anyway. He wants you. Echo's heart beat faster at Mina's words, but old insecurities died hard. Even if that's true, I don't know how to. I've never. She trailed off, embarrassed. Mina's expression softened. You've never been loved? She finished gently. Of course you haven't. Neither had any of us when we came here. But that doesn't mean you're incapable of accepting love, Echo. It just means you need to be brave enough to try. Brave. Echo had never thought of herself as brave. Stubborn, yes. Resilient, maybe. But brave implied a choice, a willingness to face fear head-on, and most of her life had been spent simply enduring, surviving, making the best of circumstances she couldn't change. But coming to the Shadow Territories had been a choice. Accepting Kane's offer to join the pack had been a choice. Perhaps it was time to make another one. That night, there was a celebration in the great hall of the fortress, a moon festival marking the autumn equinox. The entire pack gathered for a feast, for music and dancing, for the kind of joyful communion Echo had never experienced with Silvermoon. She wore a gown Mina had helped her choose, silver gray like her eye, with asymmetrical details that highlighted her scars, rather than trying to hide them. The shadows responded to her now almost as readily as they did to Caney, swirling around her like living ornaments, enhancing her movements as she walked into the hall. Conversation faltered briefly as she entered, heads turning to look at her. But unlike the stares she was used to, these were appreciative, admiring. Someone whistled, another called out a compliment, and Echo felt herself blush, even as she smiled in response. Across the room, seated at the head table but rising now to his feet, Caney watched her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He was dressed formally for the occasion, in black and silver that matched her own outfit, the shadows around him more controlled than usual, forming patterns that almost looked like ceremonial markings on his skin. He crossed the room to her, the crowd parting before him, and Echo was acutely aware of every eye upon them, of the silence that had fallen, of the expectation crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. Echo, Caney said, his deep voice carrying in the quiet hall. You look beautiful. Simple words, but spoken with such sincerity that Echo couldn't doubt them. Thank you, she replied, her own voice steadier than she felt. So do you. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Will you sit with me tonight, at the head table? It was more than a casual invitation. They both knew it. The head table was for the Alpha and his chosen companions, his closest advisors, his most trusted lieutenants, and, traditionally, his mate or prospective mate. Echo thought of Mina's words, of being brave enough to try. She thought of all the moments over the past weeks when Caney had shown her with words and actions that he saw her, truly saw her, and found value in what he saw. Yes, she said simply. I'd be honored. The feast that followed was like nothing Echo had experienced before. The food was exquisite, the wine rich and heady, the conversation around the table flowing easily from serious matters of pack business to jokes and stories that had everyone laughing. Through it all, Caney kept her included, drawing her into discussions, valuing her opinions, his hand occasionally finding hers beneath the table, in a gesture that felt both possessive and questioning. When the tables were cleared for dancing, Echo expected Caney to lead the festivities with one of the other wolves, perhaps Lyra, whose twisted spine didn't prevent her from being one of the most graceful dancers in the pack. But instead, he stood and offered his hand to Echo. "Dance with me," he said, and though it was phrased as a command, his eyes held a question. Echo hesitated only briefly. "I don't know the steps," she admitted. "Silver Moon didn't exactly include me in their celebrations." Caney's smile was warm and reassuring. "The shadows will guide you," he promised. "Trust them. Trust me." And so she did. As they moved to the center of the floor, the music began, something wild and haunting that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. Caney drew her into his arms, and the shadows swirled around them both, connecting them, guiding Echo's movements until it felt like they were dancing on air, like gravity itself had loosened its hold on them. They spun and dipped and flowed together, Echo's scarred body moving with a grace she had never known she possessed, Caney's strength supporting her through every turn. Other couples joined them on the floor, but Echo was aware only of Caney, of his amber eyes never leaving hers, of his hands strong and sure at her waist and clasping her fingers, of the way their shadows had merged into a single pattern that moved with them like a living cloak. As the music reached its crescendo, Caney pulled her closer, their bodies pressed together from chest to thigh, and Echo felt something ignite between them, a heat that had nothing to do with the exertion of the dance and everything to do with the way he was looking at her, like she was the only wolf in the world who mattered. "Echo," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "I need to speak with you, privately." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and let him lead her from the dance floor, away from the noise and the crowd, through corridors that shifted and reshaped themselves until they emerged onto the same high balcony where he had first offered her a place in his pack. The night was clear, stars visible beyond the shadow canopy, and a cool breeze carried the scent of autumn from the forests below. Caney released her hand as they reached the stone railing, putting a small distance between them, and Echo immediately missed his warmth. "I owe you an apology," he began, his voice solemn. Echo's heart sank. Here it came, the moment when he would gently explain that his interest had been misinterpreted, that he valued her as pack, but nothing more. "What for?" she managed to ask, proud of how normal her voice sounded despite the disappointment curling through her chest. Caney turned to face her, his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. "For not being completely honest with you from the beginning. For holding back part of the truth because I feared your reaction." Echo frowned, confused. "What truth?" Caney ran a hand through his dark hair, a surprisingly human gesture from someone who usually maintained such careful control. "The day you came here, when the shadows first responded to you, that wasn't normal, Echo. The shadows don't welcome strangers that way, not even potential pack members. They only react that way to one kind of wolf." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "There's a legend among shadow-touched wolves, a prophecy as old as the shadows themselves. It speaks of a mate for the Shadow King. Not just any mate, but a true equal. A queen who would be touched by fire as he was touched by darkness, who would bear the marks of her trials on her skin just as he bears his in his soul." Echo's breath caught in her throat. "A mate!" she repeated, the word barely a whisper. Caney nodded, his amber eyes searching hers. "A fire queen for the Shadow King. One who would complete him, balance him, share his power and his burden, One the shadows would recognize and welcome as their own. And you think that's me? Echo asked, disbelief warring with a wild, desperate hope in her chest. I know it's you, Caney said simply. I've known since the moment you walked into my territories without fear, since the shadows curled around you like old friends returning home. But I didn't tell you because I wanted you to choose the pack. Choose me, for your own reasons, not because of some ancient prophecy. I wanted you to stay because you wanted to, not because you felt obligated by destiny. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them again. I didn't want to pressure you, Echo. I still don't. If you want nothing more than to be pack, I will respect that. I will never mention this again, never make you uncomfortable with unwanted attention. But I need you to know the truth, because you deserve honesty from your alpha. From me. Echo's mind was reeling. A mate, the Shadow King's mate. The very concept was so far removed from anything she had ever imagined for herself that she could barely process it. For most of her life, she had assumed she would die alone, unwanted, unmatched. Even joining the Shadow Wolves had seemed like more acceptance than she had any right to expect. But looking at Caney now, at the vulnerability in his amber eyes despite his power, at the way the shadows around him seemed to reach for her, even as he held himself carefully still, Echo realized something important. Prophecy or no prophecy, she had already made her choice, had been making it in small increments every day since she arrived. Every time she sought him out for training, every time she found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, every time her heart beat faster when he entered a room. Why me? She asked, not doubting him, but needing to understand. Of all the wolves you could have, why would you want someone scarred and broken? Caney's expression softened, and he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, to trace the line of scars along her cheek with gentle fingers. You're not broken, Echo. You're marked by your experiences, shaped by them, but not diminished. Your scars are a map of your courage, your resilience. They tell me you've faced the fire and survived, that you're strong enough to stand beside me through whatever comes. His fingers moved to her silver eye, feather light against her eyelid as she closed it instinctively. This eye sees what others cannot, just as the shadows show me truths hidden from ordinary sight. We're two halves of the same whole, Echo, darkness and light, shadow and fire. His hand cupped her scarred cheek fully now, warm and strong against her skin. I want you because, when I'm with you, I feel complete in a way I never have before. Because you challenge me and support me in equal measure. Because you see the man behind the Shadow King, and you're not afraid of either. Echo leaned into his touch, her heart pounding. I'm not afraid, she whispered, and it was true. Despite everything that had happened to her, despite years of rejection and isolation, the one thing she didn't feel with Caney was fear. Then tell me what you do feel, Caney urged, his voice low and intense. Tell me what you want, Echo. Whatever it is, it's yours. Echo took a deep breath, gathering her courage. Mina was right. It was time to be brave in a new way, to reach for something instead of just enduring. I feel like I've been waiting for you without knowing it, she said softly. Like every step that led me here, even the painful ones, was leading me to this moment, to you. And what I want. She reached up, her scarred hand covering his where it rested against her cheek. What I want is you, Cain. Not because of a prophecy, or because you're the Alpha or the Shadow King. Just you, as you are. The smile that broke across Cain's face was like the sun emerging from behind clouds, transforming his usually solemn features into something radiant. The shadows around them responded, swirling up in patterns that seemed almost jubilant, like a physical manifestation of joy. Echo, he breathed, his free arms sliding around her waist to pull her closer. My Echo. And then he was kissing her, his lips claiming hers with a hunger that matched her own, and Echo was kissing him back, her arms winding around his neck, her body pressing against his as if trying to eliminate any space between them. The shadows enveloped them both, a cocoon of darkness that felt like coming home, and Echo surrendered to it completely, to him, to the feelings she had denied for too long. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caney rested his forehead against hers, his amber eyes glowing with an inner light. Be my mate, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Be my queen, rule the shadows with me. Yes, Echo answered without hesitation. Yes to all of it. The mating ceremony was held 3 days later, under the light of the full moon. The entire pack gathered in a clearing where the shadow canopy thinned enough to allow the moonlight to shine through directly, illuminating the ancient stone altar at the center. Echo wore a gown that shifted between silver and deepest black, the shadows woven into the fabric itself so that it moved around her like living smoke. Her white hair was loose, adorned with black crystals that caught the moonlight and refracted it in rainbow patterns. For the first time in her life, she wore her scars proudly, without any attempt to disguise or minimize them. Caney waited for her at the altar, magnificent in his formal regalia, a combination of shadow and substance that made him look like a figure from legend come to life. His amber eyes found hers as she approached, and the love in them was so palpable that Echo felt it like a physical touch. The ceremony itself was ancient and simple. They spoke vows in the old language of wolves, promises of loyalty and protection, of partnership and equality. Caney marked her first, his teeth breaking the skin at the juncture of her neck and shoulder, establishing the bond that would tie them together for life. As his mark settled into her flesh, Echo felt something open inside her, a connection deeper than anything she had ever experienced, a sense of Caney's presence in her mind, his emotions mingling with hers. Joy, pride, love, and beneath it all, a bone-deep satisfaction, as if something long broken had finally been made whole. When it was her turn to mark him, Echo hesitated only briefly, still half afraid that her touch would bring harm rather than happiness. But Caney's eyes held hers, confident and unafraid, and she leaned in to place her mark on his throat, her teeth breaking his skin in the ancient gesture of claiming. The moment her mark took hold, the bond between them flared like a supernova, and the shadows around them responded, rising up in a cyclone of darkness and light that surrounded them both. Echo felt power surging through her, not just Cain's power sharing through the bond, but something new, something that belonged to her alone. The fire that had scarred her body awakened within her spirit, not as pain this time, but as strength, as balance to Cain's shadows. Where his power absorbed light, hers created it. Where his concealed and protected, hers revealed and purified. As the shadows settled, Echo looked down at her scarred arm to find it transformed. The scars remained, but they now glowed with an inner silver light, like molten moonbeams trapped beneath her skin. When she touched them, they felt warm but not burning, alive with a power she was only beginning to understand. The Fire Queen, Caney murmured, his voice filled with awe as he traced the glowing patterns on her skin. My mate! My equal! The pack howled their approval, the sound echoing through the shadow territories and beyond, announcing to all wolves that the Shadow King had found his queen, that the ancient prophecy had been fulfilled. Later, as they lay together in the privacy of their chambers, limbs entwined, and the bond between them humming with contentment, Echo thought about the long, strange journey that had brought her here. From a burned child, nobody wanted to the queen of the Shadow Wolves, from an outcast to a leader, from alone to cherished. "What are you thinking about?" Caney asked, his fingers trailing along her spine. "How strange life is," Echo said honestly. "How the things that seem like curses can turn out to be blessings in disguise. If the Silver Moon Pack hadn't tried to kill me, I would never have found you." Caney pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "The moon goddess works in mysterious ways," he said. "Sometimes she has to break us before we can become who we're meant to be." Echo smiled, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. "Are you saying you believe in fate, Shadow King?" "I believe in you," Caney replied simply. "Everything else is just details." 3 years later, when young wolves would come to Queen Echo, feeling broken or cursed or unwanted, feeling like they didn't fit anywhere, she'd smile and tell them her story. About being blamed for a fire she tried to prevent. About running into the shadow territories with no hope and no future. About finding acceptance among outcasts. And love with a king who saw her scars as beautiful. "I was nobody," she'd tell them, taking their hands and looking into their eyes. "A rejected Omega with burn scars and a silver eye that made people afraid. But the very things they feared about me were the things that made me who I needed to be. The fire that scarred me gave me the power to balance the shadows. The eye they called cursed lets me see truths others miss. The rejection that drove me away led me exactly where I belonged." She'd introduce them to Caney, still powerful and imposing, but looking at her with the same love he'd shown since the beginning. "Sometimes what looks like the end of your story is actually just the beginning," she'd explain. "Sometimes you have to lose everything to find what you really need. Sometimes the scars we carry are actually maps leading us home." And those young wolves would leave her presence standing taller, believing a little more firmly that their differences weren't curses, but gifts waiting to be understood. That rejection was redirection. That somewhere, there was a place where they would fit perfectly, exactly as they were. What did you think of Echo and Caney's story? Did you feel the connection between these two outcasts who found belonging in each other? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale of acceptance, transformation, and finding love despite society's judgments, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss my next werewolf romance story. Hit the notification bell to be the first to know when new content drops. Want more stories like this? Let me know in the comments what kind of werewolf romance you'd like to see next. Rejected mates finding their true alphas, magical transformations, forbidden love between rival packs. Your feedback helps me create stories you'll love. Thank you for reading. I can't wait to bring you more adventures from the world of werewolves, magic, and true mates.